Hello everyone, today we make our Russian invasion of Ukraine September 2025 update. Telling the truth, I will not talk about everything that has happened so far. Normally I stick to the news of the later days and analyze the situation on the front line. I don't know how, usually this has been a relatively successful series so far. I don't know if you want me to post more often about this, because certain aspects of the war in Ukraine are obviously almost static. Others are much more dynamic, of course, day by day. And so far I've looked at a couple of months of distance. But of course, as it also happened on occasion, if something sort of more, say, more intense in scale occurs, more relevant from a strategical point of view, is there, we cover it also as an extra. And there is no limit, really. I'm pretty flexible. We're not also, at least so far, we haven't discussed the broader political situation in a Clausewitzian sense. We naturally observed that even in these normal series, but we never really discussed why and how this war is here, etc. I mean, I don't think to an extent that there is much to understand why that is the case. Nevertheless, again, on Schwerpunkt, I really plan to cover everything within my reach to a satisfactory level of accuracy. I'm just asking you regarding the overall picture. You also know very well since the beginning of the invasion in 2022 that I'm biased in favor of Ukraine. Bias is not perhaps the best term. I'm rather partisan, but in here, as you have noticed also in the previous episodes, I'm generally speaking trying to normalize, or at least to objectivize the broader narrative of the war. There is a lot of propaganda and also actual lack of information, not just, I will not digress on things like misinformation, disinformation. There is simply lots of things I hear. The social media is pernicious in so many ways because people without no clue about whatever is going on tend to be especially emotionally impacted by things that are not even relevant. That's mostly the, at least the aspect that I think I can bring something to the table myself, in the sense that if you properly don't follow the news, if you're not being into these things, it may seem to you that what sort of bounces on social media at some point has an importance that defines what is going on with the war, and that instead deflects from much more important issues that nobody talks about. And some of this has become ridiculous to an extent. It's not the leitmotif of this series, but my narrative that can be and will always be different from anybody else, regardless of how much it aligns with others or not, is mostly pointing toward that direction. You can find also, I created a playlist about this, and we will keep naturally covering the topic. So first off, regarding what I just said, and with the thing of the bias, I really mean this, that even if there is something that is in favor of Ukraine as a narrative and it's not true, I'm not going to say it. On the contrary, I'm going to denounce that, because at the end of the day, the sort of bottom line of the whole story is that nobody's taking the war in Ukraine as seriously as it should be in the West, regardless of how much, of course, it dominates the news, at least in certain ways. For example, the Russian MiG-31, right, the Mikoyan Gurevich 31 aircraft that entered NATO airspace the other day, has done so in a manner that has sparked a significant debate, with some reports proving, of course, accurate, while others have been demonstrably false. Specifically, there have been people even talking things like, I don't know, the aircraft traversed Tallinn, right? But instead it followed a designated route through international airspace en route to Kaliningrad. As you will understand here, basically sounding as if I were debunking the thing in favor of a Russian narrative, but this is not the case. I'm just pointing out what kind of weight this thing should have in the broader balance and picture, both politically and in a sort of potentially strategic sense. Photographic evidence clearly confirms that the MiG-31 aircraft armament consisted entirely of air-to-air missiles, indicating no intent, of course, for ground bombardment. I mean, I shouldn't even be saying this, but I've, again, seen people saying strange things or any other similar aggressive action in that case. Estonian official declarations on the matter have been widely cited, though media narratives have often exaggerated key elements. That's always the point. If you actually listen to what, generally speaking, within the West, official statements are actually about, they're not just correct, but they properly aren't sort of meaning what they're usually amplified as through the media narrative. All right. For example, unsubstantiated claims of the jets flying at 3,000 meters of altitude and at 3,000 kilometers per hour, right? Which is admittedly the maximum speed of the MiG-31, but you know very well that such planes would only risk reaching 1,900 miles per hour. And everybody's saying, oh, look, this is a plane that is kind of speedier than the F-35, and all these kind of mental, I don't even want to qualify them because I would become vulgar, but that fundamentally tell you how clueless, right, the general public opinion overall is. And by the way, had those jets actually transverse the Estonian airspace at that speed, they would have done so in mere seconds. All right. Instead, things, as we have seen, did last longer. But why did they last? Right. Never underestimate Russian incompetence, for that matter. Now, the aforementioned assertions conveniently ignore the fundamental aspects, of course, of aircraft maneuvering capabilities or the typical cruise speeds maintained at the subsonic levels to achieve optimal fuel efficiency. As it's generally speaking regular, both in the military and civilian aircraft. Moreover, attempting such extreme speeds on a MiG-31 would risk catastrophic engine failure, right? Rendering these claims not only pseudo-technical but entirely implausible, other than blatantly false. The inherent complexity of the incident arises instead from the extraordinarily narrow international airspace corridor situated between Estonia and Finland, where territorial waters and airspace boundaries intersect across the Russian, Finnish, and Estonian zones. In such confined conditions, a high-speed jet can deviate inadvertently from the corridor in mere moments, a risk further compounded by the frequent GPS disruptions prevalent in the area, also, of course, because of Russian fault. And this likely compelled reliance on less precise inertial navigation systems, where even a minor deviation could technically constitute a violation, right? What is the narrative here? That the Russian pilots were just idiots? Not only, let's say. The point is that such events are, of course, far from isolated or unprecedented. The heightened alarm stems not from this episode in isolation, but from its conjunction with a broader pattern of escalations, including Russian drones landing in Estonian and Polish territory, as we've seen in the past weeks. And as we will see, such incidents are very frequent. And in fact, also underplayed by the media to an extent in their overall picture. Now, the transit of 3 MiG-31s to Kaliningrad amid these mounting tensions does represent an unwise and provocative maneuver, potentially unintentional, though. Surely ill-timed, given the intense European scrutiny over recent Polish incidents. Prominent Russian telegram channels have reported the flights as entering Estonian territory for approximately 12 minutes, according to their adversaries, attributing the deviation to pilots veering off course during evasive maneuvers in response to intercepting Finnish and other NATO fighters that were involved, in fact, in the picture. And given these, the fact that MiG-31s are not designed for aerobatics in general, it is far more likely that the aircraft simply lost precise positional tracking within the constricted corridor due to the pressure of escorting forces without engaging in loops or other aggressive turns, which did happen in other circumstances. And every time this happens, everybody says, oh my God, it's World War III. This is escalate. And regularly, as you have seen throughout all the war, of course, this is not escalated. And not escalated in any meaningful way, aside from the fact that escalation in a worst-case scenario for total nuclear warfare would take, I don't know, dozens of escalatory steps, sort of intense, extensive political consultations, all a preparation. Remember, von Clausewitz's war is never an isolated act. The Russians that, to some extent, do not really know how to even pull themselves out of this quagmire, just sticking to it, because at worst, in that sense, they can at least grab another bit of Ukrainian land. They don't have even this escalatory concern per se, right? This could even put more pressure on them and focusing the attention on particular other aspects of the war. In fact, another very important aspect to understand, the Russians are escalating currently. They are escalating in sort of very mild ways, and in fact also these incidents, assuming even that they were made, I mean this one in particular made on purpose, I believe that this was accidental, telling the truth. In any case, would be mostly for Russian internal consumption. All right, everything the Russians say, if you actually listen to what they say internationally, they're such ridiculous things that you understand that they don't care absolutely about properly what the broader logical rationale of the statements are for the Westerners that sound, if anything, rather confused and to at some point bored by these kind of weird sable rattling without any follow-up, and for all the lies and the, like when the invasion started and Lavrov went over to India and claimed in front of the room that Ukraine had invaded them, and everybody started laughing, right? You can't think that, and those were Indians, by the way, doing so. You can't think that these statements are truly, like, yeah, there is some slimy kind of narrative, like to think like lying just as a raison d'etre, right? That's into Russian disinformation since ever, right? It's properly Bolshevik denial of reality 101. But this is much more effective if you think about it in a sociological point of view for the Russian audience that truly is programmed not to question and or to do so, but being hysterically paranoid towards anything that can sort of put them outside of their semi-survival zones. But you see, because this is what it gets down to. You listen to TV with your family, and I don't know, some family member gets upset because they said, "Oh my God, the Russians entered the Estonian airspace," and that again, it's not optimal, but is this relevant compared to what is happening in Ukraine every single day? Nobody talks about it, doesn't make it in the news because it's because of the old twisted logic of how to get more audience. That's a way. That's, for example, a level at which the Russians are working in order to properly, and that's where the terminology is debatable, misinform or disinform, like habituating the Western mindset to a kind of new normal as far as what Russia has done, and sort of capitalizing on the journalistic incompetence, lack of expertise, and some journalists do their job, but in general there is a very weird not just social media dynamics, but let's say how you say it in English, the mainstream media. I hate the term mainstream. It doesn't mean anything, but that's exactly the point. If you are habituated to think that there's a mainstream media, you already entered a narrative that there is a single thought, there is a conspiracy theory, they're hiding you things because there's just a huge block. Even when the media is lying, as it does very often, especially in the United States, I can't say I come from a country that, at some point you can always criticize yourself and everything, ideally doesn't work as it should and whatever, but you realize that, here information does not even dream to do such a level of manipulation and proper falsity like in the United States happen. And in part, that's always a reflection of what the people really think or don't think in a broader sense. And we are all in the same basket in any case, because we are also so interconnected. Just to make an example, sometimes some countries say, okay, well, there's been the scramble. Jets took off as soon as the Russians entered the airspace, and it sounds as if they had downed the Russian jets themselves, or obliged them, had engaged in any kind of ballet or, in fact, engagement proper. That's not what technically happens most of the times. What does this do in the media? The idea is this, oh my God, this is alarmistic, so let's replicate the story across multiple outlets. So this thing overly inflates itself. Von Clausewitz actually talks about this, that there's a very interesting passage in the Von Krieg in which he says maybe there is a small military event, and he's talking actual combat, by the way, that however for some reason is reported in a way, even through the same military, that is twisted, is misunderstood or whatever, that von Clausewitz talks profusely about the fact how difficult it is in the moment of battle, even when it's over, right, to actually explain what really happened, right? This can have a major moral impact, while the actual strategic situation, in a strictly military sense, would have not been altered by that engagement, as the consequences of this, we could say, fake news spread to a degree, regardless of whether they were fabricated or not. So it's a very serious thing. Here, naturally, these news are completely influenced as far as what is going on in Ukraine, right, from a strictly military point of view. But that's the point. How many of you is regularly informed about what is actually happening in Ukraine? I mean, even those of us who have been following this even before it started, day after day, etc., it happens that day that you missed the news, that you don't know what's really going on, which you're not checking all the possible indicators. And even when you do so, you're actually just reading different pages. You don't have that level of ultra competence or attention, focus, or research. All right. Also, and I noticed this because, at least as an expert in the art of war, I realized that there is, especially by the so-called strategic analysts, very often not a military historical background, or one that is just let's talk about the war in Ukraine. Let's draw the parallelisms with other war. Why? To entertain people, to make them feel like, look, this is like the other war, so that you can spend that notion, I don't know, talking with another underschooled individual at a club or whatever. Like, analyses are done seriously or not done at all. In many ways, these people are simple, amateurs. In field, it can be, political science, it can be different things without any specific preparation information, that by practice, by the fact that they stick to it for a long time, they update on the developments, feel the need to express some narratives that are also not necessarily the finest. I don't pretend, of course, to provide with particularly high quality analysis in this, but let's say that compared to what I see around, I think my updates can be some initial compass, right, for some based information. Regarding the Estonian airspace incident, satellite Hexbin data further illustrates the poor communication conditions in the incriminated zone, conditions that may have been deliberately exacerbated by the same Russian electronic jamming as a form of cover at the same time. Russian sources consistently frame NATO as outright adversaries, a stark contrast to some in fact, NATO countries' posters, let's say, proclaiming that Russia is not an enemy instead, which is an eminently political statement. Like maybe there is a country that does not want to increase taxes and or doesn't take into account the fact that there is a reason why you pay for that armament supply and production, given that it's not like Ukraine falls and Westerners finally will keep being rich because we stop sending armament to them or similar things. So it's completely cynical, short-sighted, and in many ways, at best, right, kind of attitude. Plus, there is of course some leverage on populistic fringes for political support, and at this point, we know very well how it's basically mostly also a matter of overall sympathy towards certain strata of the population, not even just a particular political orientation. In fact, most of these people just hate everything that the West represents. It's not they want to tear it down, not because they have an alternative to it at all. This would be most obvious with communism, with Marxism, but it is spreading among lesser people because fourth estaters at the end of the idea are normally nationalists and or socialists at the same time. And there is, in fact, the lesser the person, the more an overlapping in the twofold ideology. It's always been like that. It's always been, look at Russia as well. Sickle and hammer and, ultranationalism. Like we are at level proper lack of any cultural trace or any human dignity. And this is not something that can be objectively debated considering the social, say, pseudo-cultural standards that we macroscopically document. In any case, the episode of Estonian serves to underscore deeper argumentative fallacies such as the so-called hydrant technique, deflecting from core issues essentially by abruptly opening up tangential debates instead of addressing the merits. A tactic that is evident in public confrontations. There are incredibly limited spaces online, at least in relation to the eventual exposure, and access by the masses in terms of proper, preparation for such debates, drawing from comprehensive databases for rapid document retrieval, precise evaluation of them, contextualization, past knowledge, etc. This is something that, as historians, we do, and that should deserve some level of praise, if anything, because it provides with some actual evidence. And yet, in fact, you could easily make an entire YouTube channel about this stuff and easily rising to the top just by saying the obvious. This is something I've always said about Schwerpunkt itself, that people think that I'm so ultra hyper in-depth niche, whatever, but I'm just saying what a normal level of education should present. And the fact that YouTube historical accuracy has completely collapsed, or probably not even cared for any kind of deeper educational function and sort of learning instruction, so to say, for the audience. At the same time, I still get such few views, right? So it's not flattering this content as, so much better than the others. It's just realizing that others don't even try and that they're in part despicable. But going back to the subject at hand, it's obvious that if you look at the so-called mainstream media, where a guy has to talk, for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, in certain circles, there's not even properly the time to explain properly what is going on. And this is exactly what I was saying. You remember when we criticized the other channels because they may always make 15 minutes long videos, 5 of which are sponsors and other stuff. Well, this is exactly the point. How do you think that a person can learn something consistent in those? There is always a choice. There is always a reduction. You can even write the best script ever for those 10 minutes, but it's not like you will explain even properly the historical premises of why we can't have that discourse around that topic and how and why that information is valid, is acceptable, and how to put it in perspective and understand its objective value, right? That's the point. People are habituated to short stories that in and of themselves are just arithmetically to be collected and not to interact with one another. As a matter of fact, they can stimulate somebody's curiosity, intellect in some ways, but they are never going to show the actual depth, structure, and magnitude of a proper historical research, right? Now, there are some good examples of how this news fundamentally don't reach the audience, conflating entirely unrelated incidents in a manner that distorts public understanding. For example, there are some events. Remember when the drones arrived in Poland, right? Somebody suggested at some point, which is it's also a very standard kind of conspiracy, the fact that there would be a false flag of some sort, right? Clearly reminiscent of prior narratives suggesting Estonia or NATO launched balloons mimicking MiG-31s or drones to claim what, right? What would even be the point of this? Maybe stirring the political opinion? I mean, let's leave aside the actual implausibility of the thing. But in a situation like this, where the West is lazy, and the same governments do not evidently push for greater intervention, it's not like you make this fake news ad hoc, but magically people don't feel the fatigue of the war or understand why they should actually work even harder at this point if they want to have a better future and live in a better situation. That's not how you change things. These things are properly not they can only help to make some sort of background noise that can maybe orient people toward a direction or another, but they are always surpassed by the bigger structural mechanics that dramatically present themselves, just like the war in Ukraine in and of itself is the proof of, and that, again, in its details, in its substance, does not talk about. I mean, seriously, would the hell care about Gaza? I mean, seriously, given the actual political, historical, cultural situation, it's a completely irrelevant thing, right? Also because basically outside of the United States and Israel, nobody else has in the West any saying of what happens in the Near East. So even that minimal logic of realizing that, of course, we are fortunate not to give a damn about this, except for politicians that fear that some communist wants to make more riots and create more problems in that regard. We are lucky that we don't have anything to do with that. We don't have to worry about what is happening either, right? The war in Ukraine, that is at least 10 times more important than this, receives practically no coverage, right? And again, who the blip cares about Gaza? I mean, seriously, under any point of view. Now, the underlying technique here involves blatant cherry picking, right? So you can have some sources highlighting the improbability of a direct Russian attack while omitting fully 90% of the source material, which instead posits escalation through indirect tests of provocations, including the 19 Russian drones that landed in Poland, as potential such tests alongside risks like a 2014-style coup in Crimea applied to, Moldova. The level which people believe this stuff, in terms of sheer, okay, so now there is escalation, we will go, it's completely severed from it. I mean, the distance that exists between the reality and that is something enormously greater than what is constantly happening every day in Ukraine from a military point of view, in terms of civilian losses, etc., then that in turn is much bigger than any of these incidents per se really mean. And so even just in terms of political spectrum, yes, they have a meaning. And yes, this is also how you dance on, again, lesser people's mental defiance. But in general, right, it is a massive distraction, and very often it's done just to get views, get more people following you, whatever, than any actual scientific or moral reason to know what the hell is going on. And taking action on the basis of the same. Because otherwise, again, why would we even care? Now, this kind of selective framing induces to also the false equivalence, leading readers to infer that all such attacks must be fabricated as well. This is very common, at least I don't see it too much, but I definitely know people who are very involved in these things and that have to cope especially with the most irritating, not even Russian propaganda, but pro-Russia trolling basically online that claims that, again, that everything is false, that the West says that, I don't know, the Ukrainians have lost 7 million people killed and the Russians advance without a scratch. Like this kind of things that you don't even address because it doesn't even have, I don't know, any parvens of adherence to any trace of reality. And that, if anything, however, is exactly the space where that keeps, let's say, people distracted while other things are being played by the actual contendants that you don't see. Because also they don't care, don't want you to see, or just also they are irremediably, let's leave aside from the internal domestic propagandas, but let's say in general, like it's as if we live in different cognitive dimensions as a consequence. For example, in parallel coverage of the Polish house strike regarding those drones, the outlet at a point admitted that the 18 undisputed drone cases entirely, zeroing in on just one probable instance of a Polish or Dutch F-35 missile misfire or that, thereby invoking the false in one, false in all fallacy to generalize doubt across the board. So it's not like the Russian drones were there, and that is important by some dimension, but no, there is this notion, look, here there's been a mistake, which can easily happen, especially in war, and it does all the time, which enters even just the scale of probability, exactly the ones that is habitually happening at different levels of the military spectrum. But no, right? And so no drone wreckage was found at that specific site, but crucially the missile in question was targeting a Russian drone, a defensive action that this detail suppresses to avoid any contextualization might portray it as legitimate as well, right? Because planes are there to shoot down the drones as well, and this is dangerous because, of course, you're going to risk shooting also at your own soil at that point. And so such dishonest journalism systematically withholds essential data, deliberately shaping reader opinion towards narratives of fabrication, and especially this tendency in, as we said before, in pro-Russian circles that are, in my opinion, they know they're lying, because, again, I can't think that somebody can be more stupid than Russian propaganda that is at least domestically directed. And so, again, we don't have to digress on the neurocognitive condition of Russian people, but that at least can be understood in, if you're a Russian, again, you stay there, you're habituated to be passive and subservient, you don't give a damn essentially about what is happening in Ukraine, and in this sense Westerners do, but they are also more properly disconnected, as I was just referring to, properly what it means to be in a country at war from either side, which is very different in different ways, but that, again, in my opinion, in fact, is the reason why you are even just trolling about the stuff. Because if you had any level of seriousness, or if you were, this is about the Russophile side, that if you had actually any interest in supporting Russia, you would actually even listen to or read what Russian military bloggers write, right? Or being interested in general with narrative that, of course, do not claim what you're claiming. And so we are also taking trolling a bit too much. I personally, when I started making these videos, I thought there would be a lot of sort of pro-Russian sentiment, etc., because this Russian propaganda is so Russophilia is so unhinged and so sort of coming from probably just mentally disturbed people, if they actually believe in what they're saying, that it's so loud that sometimes even a normally minded person says, but why are these people so loud? How can a person, like a fully developed human being, can go out there and be considered, I don't know, an adult or mature person? They must have something, right? It must be just a side of the story. No, it's just the kid shouting the loudest, right? Just the phreniasthenic, not yet pre-frontal cortex level of, consolidation type that can do something like that. Again, the same Russian analysts saying different things. Doesn't matter how biased they are, but still, right? If you knew anything about what they write, what they say, you would at least be a bit more decent of a person. And so, because that's always the thing, this minimal crowd dismissing Polish, like the Polish airspace violation by drone incident as a self-inflicted or as a result also of alleged Ukrainian electromagnetic tricks that selectively, by the way, downed only Gerber reconnaissance drones equipped with Polish subscriber identity modules that, as you know, the Russians have mounted on those drones in double fuel tanks. Why? And utterly implausible feat amid a swarm of 800 drones, right? You cannot electromagnetically jam just in these swarms the drones that you prefer, right? There is not the technology, the capacity, the even just the material possibility of doing it in any other way. So again, I say this not to steer any particular support for Ukraine that I discussed in other videos, and that, of course, at the bottom line of this content is about, it is for, but just for showing the complete unseriousness of certain actors in front of general circumstances that, however, we are more invested by, paradoxically, than the actual serious stuff. The other great BS that is more widespread in general, more repeated. Why do I say this? Because, as I pointed out at the beginning of the video, I'm not hiding also the counter-narrative to this. The media fabricated for years this idea that, at least here we are extremizing a little bit, right? And there are certain things that should be better addressed. For example, I shall make a video about the 2023 Ukrainian counteroffensive, which I think would require a very solid Clausewitzian frame to understand from both a political and strategical point of view, so to assess eventually whether that was worth it, if it had to be done or not, because people went as far as saying Ukrainians did not have to make any counteroffensive, like the Kursk one. Not just we know that, of course, war is a continuation of politics with other means, but of course, a different target could have also yielded more results, right? If the Ukrainian counteroffensive had been more limited in 2023 and directed, for example, at Bakhmut, where the Russians were still devoid of any flank consolidation, all that mechanized potential could have been very well spent retaking literally the city that was in rubble, but basically annihilating any claim of moral superiority or satisfaction for the meat grind that was, again, it had a general purpose, but was also, especially at the time, like completely excessive for especially for the Russians in terms of offensive losses. And in any case, other thing, the fact that Putin is cornered and on the brink of defeat. This is not true, right? It's just not true just as much as it's not true that Ukrainian is cornered and on the brink of defeat, which is actually the broader narrative that also sort of the conservatives that decided for some reason that Ukraine was Biden's war. And so it's the only, if that hadn't happened on Trump, everybody would have supported. If not everybody, but let's say it would have been more digestible, right, to support Ukraine, because that was also mostly from the U.S., the main leading interpretation of the war. Never mind that from the Russian side you have people that like Stalinism and hate all Westerners, and that, I don't know, among the Ukrainians there are actual, in some cases, far right wing. You know what I'm talking about. Units, feelings in general, and Ukraine is notoriously a much more traditionally conservative country than Russia is by far in terms of, look at Russian atheism, baby motherhood, general sort of radical ideologies in anti-traditional sense. In any case, this is the actual problem nowadays, that if you sort of, the debate is a sort of ideological, emotional iron arm between people online, as opposed to realizing what the thing is, right? In war, things are actually more unpredictable than it seems, right? For example, when people say that Ukraine cannot advance anymore, cannot reach Crimea, tendentially, that's a probability. That's a great probability. But you see, when a front collapses, if you say even 2 years from now, who the hell knows how things will be at that point, right? And it's like, I don't know, look at when Prigozhin rebelled. Absurdly. His men actually turning against the Russian army. And surely there were negotiations with Zaluzhny and whatever. And, or, I don't know, maybe Zaluzhny's plan in autumn that was instead diverted by Zelensky, not in attacking the east, the Don, but in Zaporizhia, that would have severed at that point the Russian army in two, and basically would have obtained Crimea had it succeeded. But we know how it succeeded in this as well. I mean, these are all possibilities, right? The reason war is not this deterministic place where nothing can ever happen. Right, everything can easily collapse at some point, or if not easily, at least at some point, can quickly collapse. And that's not something you can simply predict, right? It's just like, I don't know, all the illnesses that Putin would have. For some reason, since the beginning of the war, Putin is crazy. Putin has cancer or nasal diphtheria. Whatever, and there are all this sort of wishful thinking. At the end of the day, I presume that this is just like how to keep people emotionally satisfied. I personally, irrationally, my own thing is, what's the ruble doing, right? I often check that, because the idea that at some point there is some financially, say it's crippling. I don't believe in the collapse of Russian economy, of course, but I believe in a substantial involution to the point that greater political pressure can rise to bring this thing nowhere, really, to the point at some point one have to give up. Again, it's not a fantasy in the sense that it can't happen, but it's a fantasy because by all the indicators available in the moment, we're not able to predict this. And other fake news like the use of refrigerator chips as makeshift weapons, assertions that Russian missiles had been fully depleted. And from the other side, the Russians said, no, they're not fully depleted. They are still actually depleted. Because otherwise they would have consistently used it much more. Like the intensity of 2022 is not to be seen nowadays. For these actual limitations, war costs enormously. So it's the half full, half empty glass debate that is useless if you don't actually provide objective quantitative evidence. So these are narratives that still outlets copy from one another despite their glaring consistencies. There is the other thing that I was hinting at before, namely how much land the Russians are taking, right? So just the basic level of idiocy. There are people saying that Russian advance 14 kilometers daily, obviously implying an inevitable path to victory with each passing day. So basically, in 365 days from now, the Russians are in Lisbon, according to this. Where does that number come from? Of course, the fact that we're talking about 14 square kilometers, which is like saying 20 meters per 700, right? Which also, considering the 320,000 square kilometers of Ukraine, represent basically 0.004% of the entire Ukraine. So even in a year, the sustained advance, aside from the fact that, of course, this is a war of attrition, and overall, that's also the most interesting aspect of the struggle, so to say. Of course, this thing of counting kilometers is probably one of the stupidest things you could do to begin with. And in fact, you shouldn't even flatter too much yourself of the fact that Russian advances are so bradypic, because of course Ukrainians take losses as well, and so that's a bit the most important issue as I was talking about as well. And so if you point to what the Russians gain daily, we're talking about something that on national maps you can't even see. So make this 14 kilometers per day. Kyiv dists from the front lines like 500 kilometers. So basically in 1 month they're there, right? It sounds like at the beginning of the war, say 3 days we are in Kyiv. It's already done. Without mentioning, of course, the fact, and this is objectively true, that Ukrainians have still formidable defenses, because it sounds as if sometimes Ukrainians now are in elastic defense, they're withdrawing. Of course, it's not like they have the strategic upper hand. They don't, right? They're in disadvantage, but they actually have hell of defenses. And at some point, we'll have, if anything, to make a video about this too. Right, and never think Maginot Line doctrine, let's say, that fortifications alone are the answer to everything either. But you've also seen how much the Russians have bled to basically still not have captured a single decent place that gives them any, here in this, for example, summer offensive, any actual advantage in the theater other than tactical. And so, unfortunately, we have to cope. And I'm talking here, not even talking about the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians have their own ways of telling, not telling, also to their people, certain things. Here, I'm mostly criticizing the West in general, because our condition, at least you understand the Ukrainians, you do not understand how certain things are possible in the West, right? About the Russians, we all know how Russia is, but so we don't even discuss it. But the question here is, how few it would take to make things work properly, and the average person just a minimal, right, ABC of what is going on. And so, if you have hostile acts executed with plausible deniability, you can play this emotional card. You can escalate or de-escalate, just shrouding your true motives into some fog that at least the masses, the so-called public opinion, does not practically see. Going back to the Estonian incident, the MiG-31s operated with transponders turned off and unreported routes, which is a highly unprofessional approach for patrols near tense borders, right? It may well be that the Russians don't give a damn. It may well be that this was unintentional as well as it was intentional, right? But never underestimate also incompetence. And this, by the way, followed prior Ukrainian strikes on a Kyiv government building using an inert missile, that is to say, not a stray one, and resulting in low damage, which tested reactions and paved the way for the Polish drone incidents in between these events, as well as this latter airspace violation that in general, again, you can see somehow it fits a general pattern of provocation and at least testing, because this is what this is all about. It has no military relevance, but it does have a political one. The Russians are well aware of NATO assets through their extensive radar and antenna networks in Kaliningrad. Of course, NATO displays crushing conventional and also unconventional superiority. If, of course, the major warfare was to escalate, Russia is obliterated as much as the West. There's no way out of the maximum escalation. But, of course, also in terms of basic, like what supports the impulsant NATO military force, infrastructure, etc., and all the various sort of also civilian dimension of the various countries surrounding Kaliningrad. And not only that, it's very well known to the Russians as far as the West does for Russia. So these actions, these provocations, are not technical reactions, right? Even with the current exercising, you're going always to have the boomer relative that asks, "Oh my God, they're making exercise. What does it mean? That can be the Third World War right now." This kind, and these are people, by the way, who lived in the Cold War and didn't understand even that they could be pulverized in a nuclear holocaust. And here, living at least in Western Europe in matters of very short time, simply living their weird, dissolute life amidst fascist and communistic violence of those years. But in any case, the technical reactions are all very well known. It's not like Russia has to test what the West does militarily in case of even full escalation. They know that pretty darn well, as much as we know pretty darn well what the Russians do in a situation like that. The only thing that obviously matters at all is political resolve. Right? The minimal outcry to date has enabled further escalation, a far cry from the decisive response, for example, when Turkey downed a Russian jet after just 27 seconds in a 1.6 kilometers intrusion. That happened in 2015. Beautiful pictures. And not only that, at the time, the Turks downed a Russian jet. And not only that, but Russia, after that, kept selling S-400, that is to say, the same surface-to-air missile systems that had downed their own jets to the same Turkey. That, I also would like to stress, is a NATO country. So now everybody is, again, I can't use vulgarity, at least by principle here, but now, would it be just a big deal if, I don't know, some Baltic took down a Russian jet that flies over their airspace? Well, in a sense, obviously, yes, it would be a major issue. But why? Because the current political situation is much more, it's not even that it's closer to pulling the trigger of any major escalation, but would immediately be weaponized for any other kind of action. For example, repercussions against Ukraine, more bloodshed, more sort of sustained terroristic bombing campaign, all that you can imagine. It's like, I don't know, the no-fly zone over Ukraine. In the past weeks, as you know, NATO has made some step forward, has basically, at least some countries have decided to down Russian drones with NATO armies, for at least as an hypothesis, within a certain in a certain space within Ukraine itself, which is essentially a way to say, okay, we're thinking about establishing a no-fly zone over at least, I don't know, half of Ukraine. I also inserted here a picture that is, it's all toying, but it's basically showing the Russians that we have the initiative and we can toy with escalation too, if this is a viable mean to put enough pressure to the Russian Federation. A Reuters report from late August of this year discloses that Pentagon officials, including David Becker, convened with European diplomats to deliver a pointed message. The United States had planned to cut certain security aid packages targeting Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. The very members bordering Russia, as you know, Trump said something different about Poland recently, which was also partly aimed at counterbalancing that, and urging greater European self-reliance to reduce dependency on American support, particularly concerning Trump's, as you know, at least general narrative of, you know, administration shifting focus towards domestic defense priorities, except, again, like the U.S. is arming further Taiwan, that is, however, also sending weapons to Poland in the process. It's a bit like, again, I stop sending weapons directly to Ukraine, but I let Europeans buying the American ones, which all fits here. It's debatable, and that's why I don't talk politics in a general sense. But again, the notion that other NATO countries had to pay more for their defense, reaching the prefixed level of expenditure, the fact that, again, the United States can make leverage on the West to some degree that can't benefit the United States without, however, emboldening Russia more than much. The problem is that after those statements by exit regarding the sort of, at least this is an announcement, right, of reducing certain aid packages to the Baltics, immediately after this, there's a surge in intensified Russian incursions into NATO airspace. Surprise, surprise. And they're not even just these ones. Poland with the drones, Estonia with the MiG-31s. This is the cost of words sometimes. And politics is work like this. I mean, if you... again, I expressed my opinion regarding Trump's policy. I personally am not surprised that Trump would behave the way he did. Surely in his own way he exceeded, he said terrible things and whatever, but it was notorious that the US would keep actually supplying Ukraine, as Trump did with a larger package than any of Biden's had been. And that, however, there is this juggling of circumstances due probably to also a level of indecision, given the oddity of course, having promised to end the war. But, of course, the problem of this war being always there, meaning Russia and, the fact that there is not really a diversionary policy that can reach any other compromise, if not through battlefield confrontation. In any case, I'm personally, I don't know, this is a very personal opinion, but I think that Trump, I don't really like the guy in a strictly personal sense, but politically speaking, I think that he is, at least for how his image is described in Europe, very deeply misunderstood in a broader Western situation. I mean, I can understand if you're a Baltic in this context and hating his guts and whatever, but the notion that he would be just a far-right isolationist, an ideologue, a proto-fascist, whatever, it's a complete pile of BS, right? There are people like, I don't know, for example, Charlie Kirk, in general, nice guy, but he was one of those shy conservatives as far as Ukraine is concerned. Why? For instrumental purposes. Because again, the notion, which is not, in fact, I don't know, we should support Russia instead of Ukraine. No, of course, it's not like conservatives would make the deal. Some would attempt to do that to gain some traction or whatever in the populistic level, but it's always the notion, oh no, we have to stop the war. If you keep fighting, it's because you want the war to go on. Well, yeah, because guess what? If you are invaded, at some point you have to stop the person who's invading you, and that's all what we're trying to do. It would be enough just to say such a simple thing, or just to show the entire picture, including the fact that it's a complete and massive BS that the NATO expansion is a threat to Russia, and or that anybody ever promised Russia that other free countries that had just broken off of communist terror as, in fact, independent countries now, would freely join NATO. as they, as their parliaments really. So the level of, that's where, if anything, this is the level of conspiratorial Russophilic narrative where I think I meet the greatest disturbance. The notion that for some reason NATO is doing has done a wrongdoing to Russia per se, not as if situation in Russia wasn't bad enough to attempt this desperate move against Ukraine. It was a multi-generational perspective, which is in a bigger scheme what actually this war is all about. Like, the Russians need Ukraine to survive as a people because they suck as a people. All right, and they don't have any other means but ravaging other countries because they don't have the capacity to stem Chinese influence. They have a massive demographic crisis. They're full of Islamic immigrants. They have certain socioeconomic indicators that are not even normal for a second world country. And on other things, having the means to do, but eventually channeled in this sort of disruptive and highly risky and gambles that brought to the deaths of literally of millions in this picture. So that's the bigger picture nobody discusses, or they attempt to, but it's not really convenient because nobody really. This is the problem of this war. Nobody really knows what the blip to do, because everything has a cost, right? It would be most obvious for the West to be way more compact in supporting Ukraine. At this point, probably the war would have already ended had that happened in a proper sense. But that's the problem. There is also a lot of work to do on the battlefield, and without that help, we're just diluting the war, hoping that, I don't know, in 2 years, maybe something else will have come about for which the war would have stopped. But you don't reason in terms of years in order to enact a specific policy or strategy, unless you're particularly sure of certain direction. It's easier to do for policy in a sense that for war. It's just a symptom of weakness, right? Let's talk about the things that in fact are not good for Ukraine. Again, here we are, as far as possible, accurately and objectively describing the situation, right? There may be any, of political spurring for what is happening, but it's important to understand the better and the worse. Let's start from this. Russian drone production is expanding significantly through the Rubicon forces, which, as you know, is a specifically, initially drone dedicated unit, which first appeared in the Kursk salient and now comprise 16 battalions. A video tour by the propagandist Vladimir Solovyov of one such production facility inadvertently allowed open source intelligence analysts to geolocate the site to empty warehouses adjacent to Kubinka's Armored Museum in Moscow, despite attempts at pixelation for censorship. Rubicon elevates drone operations beyond mere brigade-level tactical applications that, as you know, have been dominating the Russian invasion of Ukraine, for instance. The 1428th Motorized Rifle Regiment's first-person view strikes on Ukrainian infantry to broader operational interdiction, suppressing enemy air defenses, artillery, and logistics in a manner akin to suppression/destruction of enemy air defenses, missions, or close air support, thereby creating denial bubbles extending 30 kilometers deep into enemy territory. Unlike Ukrainian drone battalions, which are typically embedded within individual brigades, Rubicon functions as a de facto air force, targeting supply lines from Liman to Yarova, as evidenced by strikes in Rodinske that disrupted commander centers in Dobropilia, using suicide drones at deployment unusual for Geran 2S's, essentially the Shahed 136 equivalents, and signaling a clear tactical evolution even. While Ukrainian drone units employ similar tactics, as a matter of fact, they lack the scale to match how much we discussed the importance of collective training. And also, sometimes it's a matter of military organization and therefore of targeted reforms. Rubicon's projected growth to 20 to 30 battalions by mid-2026, so doubling within the span of 1 year or a bit more, could prove overwhelming. Naturally, at that point, Ukrainians will have come up themselves with something. In any case, this would, interestingly, as fundamentally shift the war towards a remote dominance where drone intensity per square kilometer could outweigh traditional infantry flag planting, which is something really mind-blowing in a general doctrinal sense, or at least something that in this war we're witnessing to the degree that we realize that future military operations will have a lot to do with this type of probably of tactics, and not just of drones, because this thing of doctrine, because these measures have really developed throughout the war. It's not like you could do this simply, but after 3 years of war, 3 years and a half, by the way. Ukrainian F-16s, so fighting Falcons, made their combat debut by intercepting Russian Kh-101. So these are the air-launched cruise missiles during a massive barrage involving approximately 600 drones and 40-45 missiles, fulfilling the predicted conservative role of augmenting air defenses without exposing the aircraft to high-risk engagements against surface-to-air missile system 400 or bomb-dropping Russian planes. Mirage 2000s, the Dassault, likely performed a similar function, possibly against drones themselves. Their first reported operational use in this capacity is a sensible choice given that the aircraft is fairly old, which precludes more aggressive fighter roles. Overall, the Russian summer offensive has concluded its initial phase without achieving any true substantial success, other than tactical ones. We know that advances in Velika Novosylka and Kurakov occurred in 2024, but known in 2025, have materialized towards key objectives like Konstantinivka, Pokrovsk, or Kupiansk, which would pave the way to Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. So that bulk, that belt, is still intact, and there has been, as we will see now better, we've seen also from the last video in July, that the Russians can spring basically on the flanks of these settlements, but there isn't really even much in between to hinge on, and if anything, just gradually overwhelming Ukrainian defenses with high losses. As we've seen in these months, however, with by the rhythm they were habituated with increasing dynamism, but still at a scale that is really negligible. In strategic relevance, right? This is the actual aspect of this war. It's obviously all a mean to an end. This is attritional warfare, but also in terms of actual strategic assets, some cornerstones where you can hinge sort of a wider operation. Like the Russians are not there yet, nor they seem close to it. In fact, while tactical gains have created vulnerable Ukrainian salients and cauldrons that all feel Russians seem to be so excited by, as if everything were to collapse tomorrow and Russians arrive in Kyiv, these have in fact not translated into strategic breakthroughs at all. The ongoing rotations of Marine and VDV, that is the Vozduzhno-Desantnie Vojska, the Russian airborne forces units, such as the 170th, the 77th, and the 150th brigades, to the predicted zones explained the apparent delays. In fact, these involve phased swaps across hundreds of units conducted amid active combat to prevent exploitation by adversaries who, however, often strike precisely during such vulnerable handovers. This is really typical, especially in positional warfare, at least World War I scenarios. The best way to infiltrate, to attack at night, whatever, was exactly after the Rota had switched unit and therefore the latter having to habituate to the terrain, knowing better all the various corners, etc. Russian reports claim gains of 3,400 square kilometers since March. I would like to stress 3,400 square kilometers, like saying square of 58 kilometers, right, in 6 months. And by the way, these figures have been contested by the Institute for the Study of War at 2,346 square kilometers, with military bloggers noting the inclusion, in fact, according to the Russians in the account, of pre-2024 or early 2024 territories, as well as so-called gray zones of uncontrolled land marked as fully captured in the Russian account. This is obviously part of a specific propaganda effort, which is definitely not that flattering, and a form of counterproductive self-deception, by the way, that mirrors the long-standing Russian, in part this happens also for the Ukrainian, habits of suppressing bad news, such as unreported withdrawals or the daily flag planting stunts near Kupiansk that are routinely reclaimed. That is, again, ridiculous, but amidst the scale of the war, planting, surely it has its moral value, in a general sense, and this will influence, in a broader sense, the performance of the troops by some degree. But in general, what are we even talking about? Persistent command distrust arises from these inflated field reports. Just yesterday, I was watching also sometimes there are some guys that forget to switch off the camera while they're talking. There were this Russian commanders complaining of still the meat assaults. As you'll see now, those are sort of relatively decreasing in terms of proper tactical performance, but in practice they're still there. General Viktor Muzhenko, who served as commander of the Ukrainian armed forces from 2014 to 2019, and now works as a lead researcher at the Institute of Armed Forces, assesses the 11-year Russo-Ukrainian War, so basically 2014-2025, as a prolonged process. Of course, Ukraine secured victory in the initial phase of the 2022 full-scale invasion by holding the Russians at the borders, but progress over the subsequent 3 years has been negligible when measured by village counts or territorial percentages. Yet, it remains premature to declare that Ukraine is losing. This is, again, yet another, especially, again, Russophilic kind of saying, no, Ukraine is doomed, just wait and see, this kind of thing. Again, it can't be predicted. There is not at the moment any clear indication that Ukraine is losing the war, and there is some sort of weird semantic manipulation saying Ukraine loses the war if it loses, all what it has lost up to this point also, even if the war was to stop now, right? People have problems in digesting Clausewitzian theory that tells us that victory and defeat are subjective, in the sense that you can have, again, some countries that do not even see themselves as defeated and go on, others that feel themselves defeated even though they haven't quite been even defeated on the battlefield at some point. Everything can be truly molded. What here Ukrainian victory looks like is they managed to stamp like the Russian invasion and basically holding their ground until the Russians get tired of that. That alone would be a victory. Before I pronounce myself on the even the possibility of Ukraine to reclaim other land, because again, you don't know what's going to happen. Here we've seen relatively, there haven't been de facto sieges, like there have been specific, of course, siege battles for different centers, etc. We're talking very small amount of forces. Overall, there has been this very long border that, in this sense, is a problem for both involved, but more in perspective for the Russians. And any strategic concentration hasn't involved, for example, a major siege of the siege of a major city, right? It could be Kharkiv or Dnipro, or even if we're looking at bigger, the belt fortresses that the Russians are supposed to say, they're nothing compared, say, to Bakhmut, that was the most famous siege of the war. So we're really still talking of a, say, bradypic, but also, as we've seen, fundamentally, strategically, not irrelevant, because people make the mistake of thinking that if there is no, again, major city default, there is no strategic consequence. There is always a strategic consequence for everything, right? If you follow the actual definition of strategy by von Clausewitz. The Russians, however, have held the initiative since the Kursk incursion, imposing their terms on the battlefield. We have already commented on the Ukrainian Kursk incursion and its end as well. It had an eminently political function, of course, and the fact that the Ukrainians were dislodged from there is also not this, it was mostly a pain for the Russians. And in fact, in general, the Russian successes remain tactical. They have not yet strung together a series of actions to achieve some broader strategic goals, and this is still manifest and habitual in their overall way of war in the theater. Key Ukrainian challenges, including the early invasion influx of volunteers, which led some commanders, such as Zodol, criticized by Azov's Prokopenko for the massacres at Kherson and Krinky, to engage in wasteful planning under the assumption of inexhaustible manpower. The delayed fortification of defenses following the failed 2023 counteroffensive left a critical gap with no effective plan B in place, forcing troops into rigid engagements within the optimal 20-30 kilometers defensive belt. So ceding this territory would prelude any elastic retreat, anchoring forces in place amid steadily worsening conditions. Any negotiations involving the cession of these lands, for instance, under a hypothetical agreement that is ever more distant between the two contenders, or between Trump and Putin, would be utterly untenable, by the way, as they form the backbone of Ukraine's containment strategy. It's to say, the Ukrainians are largely anchored along this actual defensive belt. What I was talking about before, the fact that there are formidable defenses, is that these defenses are formidable, and still, especially in Donbass, the Ukrainians' key fortified centers, hold as a massive belt, and that's also why specifically this 20-30 kilometer defensive belt, especially in that part, that, as you know, is the one that Putin demands the most, at least within the story of the oblasts, etc. Putin actually wants great parts of, concretely, of central Ukraine, southern Ukraine, because some of the most precious mineral resources, rare earth, lay there. And so at the moment, this is yet another, aside from how Ukrainians have been managing this defense, and regardless of the obvious concerns for the fact that Ukrainian manpower is not infinite, however, it's still far from exhaustion, renders Ukrainian defensive ever more static. In this sense, also bloody for the Russians, but bloody for the Ukrainians as well. Right? We have seen in the Frauenkriege essentially how sort of strategical withdrawal have to be operating, and at the moment, Ukrainians do not have that capacity of properly an elastic retreat, no any strategic convenience, all in all, to do so. And again, for the foreseeable future, in any conventionally expandable strategic sense, things are not going to change. Passing to the various sectors, here I still use the Wikipedia map because it's fairly well updated. It doesn't have the Unfortunately, all the precise villages where most of combats in some cases are critically happening, but for our YouTube videos, it's good enough. The important is realizing, again, not much how much color here is yellow or red, but what does such movements, such change practically, strategically mean? In the Sumy sector, Russian forces have made no discernible progress. Units positioned in Yunakivka and Karivka appear exhausted, leaving their flanks at risk, by the way, and tying down Ukrainian brigades without yielding any meaningful gains. Current tactics involve sparse forward posts that deliberately ignore small Russian infiltrations of, 10 men, say, ceding those encounters to drone strikes instead. The Russians, in turn, have adapted by deploying assault and reconnaissance teams that gradually build to platoon strength before calling in reinforcements. So the relatively porous front here is basically contested with these small units that gradually build up under attack, and this is actually quite costly. Consider that the largest mechanized push observed here has involved just something like 8-10 vehicles. This was attempted at Orehiv and Siversk. Elsewhere, operations remain confined to company scale. By the way, fireable bombs, the FABs, like high explosive aviation bombs, munitions, remain unmitigable at present. This was a long story from last year. Here, consider again this relentless effort. Women's recruitment efforts in Ukraine are present, but they're minor, accounting for 12-15% of Ukrainian roles, predominantly in logistics and communications, with combat participation still low, by the way. Now, speaking of demographics, those are also indicators. Now, developments in Kupiansk highlight a highly porous front line as well, more than the previous one. Where meaningless flag swaps, such as those in Sobolivka and Moskovka, offer no strategic insight. They're just really crude, bloody clashes to gain and eventually lose and regain, etc. Single destroyed positions, by the way. Russian forces stabilized the northern bridgehead in mid-August through the efforts of the 144th and 154th Brigades, successfully repelling Ukrainian attempts to reduce the salient. In the last 72 hours, deeper infiltrations have reached the Soviet-era high rises, providing elevated overlooks just 1 kilometer from the central bridge, a position that, if captured, would sever eastern logistics across the Oskil River, by the way. The Russians bypassed defenses via tunnel in Radkivka, extending from Liman Pers to Radkivka, emerging between fortified positions in a roadside post. Infantry carrying ammo established a bridgehead before Ukrainian forces could respond with flooding and wiring of 2 or 3 pipelines. The Azov Brigade has been deployed to stem the tide, while new defenses to the south and west indicate, however, the anticipation of further deterioration of Ukrainian positions. To the south, assaults target Shandri-Holove, Novoselivka, and Dobrovsil along the Neros River to outflank positions. Maneuvers in the Serebryanka forest aim to isolate Yarova as well. Rubicon units here interdict northern routes, compelling reliance on a vulnerable southern path through swamps and ponds where canals or pontoons would serve as a desperate last resort. In the Liman area, Russian probes into Serebryanka, Druzhivka, Novoplatonivka, and Klinove seek to envelope flanks and block both northern and southern roads, with Rubicon strikes hammering supply lines as well. Around Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, and Konstantinivka, stratified defenses have stalled frontal assaults. Glide bombing campaigns totaling 4,000 m over 2 months and a half concentrate on Rudinska's flank to compel withdrawal, throw logistics denial, bypassing the entrenched urban core. A vast gray zone between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka continues to confuse control assessments following a failed 20-kilometer penetration from the Russian side. Ongoing rotations, including the 175th, 177th, 26th VDV, the 11th and the 40th Air Assault Units to the 8th Combined Armed Corps, aim either at the rear of Dobropilia and Kramatorsk or both if opportunities arise. On the left flank of Pokrovsk near Udi, Ukrainian forces have stabilized positions beyond the river and Novopavlivka with counterattacks reclaiming Tolstoy and Zeleny. The Russians, frustrated by the rivers and pass, have shifted to a northern bypass exploiting defensive gaps near Velika Novozilka, a move that threatens the entire Zaporizhia line by targeting the Huliai-Pole logistics hub to outflank Orehiv and dismantle defenses horizontally much, as they did in Bakhmut and Avdiivka. Here, instead, from Kamyansk towards Stepnohirsk, a 7-8 push could encircle Zaporizhia via its narrowest point. Ukrainian anchors in Stepnohirsk, Primorske, and Malokaterynivka resist amid intricate defenses. Thus, as you understand, the Russian summer offensive ultimately failed to achieve its core goals, namely the capture of Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk by October, but it has nonetheless left Ukrainian positions in a precarious state, with Pokrovsk now just approximately 8 kilometers from potential closure, encircled on a 270-280 degrees, ranging within mortar range, by the way. So no sort of more enabling successes have been scored by the Russians. However, the autumn and winter rotations may yet trigger a domino dam effect, as bypassing the final 10-15 kilometers of defensive layers, exposing 10-15 kilometers of defensive layers would expose vast voids beyond. By the way, it's not like the Ukrainians are not actually consolidating further defensive lines behind this. We're getting there. It's just very messy in the sense that the Russians have the strategic initiative, they have numerical superiority, Ukrainians have a stretched front as well. Russians, again, take heavy casualties, Ukrainians take their own, but they're still stretched. So, these territorial gains must be contextualized carefully. The 28 square kilometers seas north of Kharkiv, for instance, traverse empty terrain of little value, whereas the 40 square kilometers in densely defended areas hold far greater significance. Current metrics of 1 kilometer per day or 14 square kilometers provide an unreliable gauge for post-breach scenarios, by the way. So, as we understand, not much has really changed. It seems like, the front at this very local level has become more fluid because of this, just as a consequence of the obvious Russian momentum in the offensive, but as we've seen, without any actual success in a broader, strategically meaningful fashion for the Russians. And that's always the same topic that we highlighted before, namely attritional warfare, right? What is going on, right? What are we looking at in terms of actual losses, and what does this mean in general? Also, as far as recruitment goes, because, for example, recruitment of force is slowing on the Russian side. In fact, while bonuses have remained stagnant for 6 to 7 months, despite a 400% increase from 2022 levels, in the second quarter of 2025, only 37,900 individuals received signing bonuses, compared to 92,800 in the same period of 2024. While the first half of 2025 saw 127,500 recipients versus 167,200 the prior year. This is fascinating. And so we have also staggering losses. From the Russian side, we're talking about 130 confirmed killed. These are big numbers. We're talking total. So it's actually an estimated 219,000 total, excluding Luhansk and Donetsk units prior to 2025 integration of the private military companies like Wagner, yielding essentially approximately 700,000 casualties under 1 to 3 KIA to WIA, so killed and wounded in action respectively ratio, encompassing KIA, missing in action, prisoners of war, without counting post-traumatic stress disorder. So we're talking an incredibly high amount of losses. The Ukrainian estimated deaths are 170,000. For a total, however, only 400 to 500,000 total casualties, due to the fact that basically the Russians have been hammering defensive positions with superior firepower, but also been exposed in the open during advances. So overall, basically the Russian, here where, by the way, numbers are very approximated because of too many reasons now to be able to digress on, but these are basically the scales. It's also predictable, aside from who took more or less by scale. Like this is a large strategic confrontation, shows a particularly strong sort of equivalent scale of losses. How do we think about this, about the Ukrainians? Well, from 2022 data that counted 56,000 dead, mid-war leaks that estimated 100,000, and Zelensky's call for 400,000 annual recruits. Disparities are stark. Poorer regions bear the brunt, with Bashkiria, we're talking from the Russian side, of course, suffering 6,400 losses at a population density of 5.5 dead per square kilometer. Naturally, they go pick, the inferior cultures within the federation, minorities and so on. This is different compared to Moscow, that has 3,600 losses in total. So basically 252, depending on how you count this, 3,300 per kilometer, per square kilometer. When you look at the wall, you realize that overall losses are declining, particularly in infantry. From the Russian side, thanks to small group tactics, glide bombs, and Rubicon operations. The 2025 peaks were lower despite territorial gains, which essentially brought, of course, to greater pressure, so increased falling in the offensive, shifting from early volunteer dominance to mobilized and contract units as well. Vehicle attrition has halved over the past year and a half, prompting a turn to expendable assets like Bohanka vans and scooters rather than vulnerable armor. So, because it's bigger target. Drone operators prove far easier to recruit at this point in frontline infantry for obvious reasons, helping compensate for shortfalls. And in the broader picture, we think that the war is likely extending into 2026, 2027. And we must also assess that from the Ukrainian side, we could explain this in a broader sort of moral and strategical sense. Enthusiasm is eroding, especially following the Ukrainian offensive's failure. Naturally, this is a simplistic narrative, but if you think about it at this point, like Ukrainians, we explained that they're not cornered. They have yet all cards to play. However, the general fatigue of the system is felt. It's not like the Russians are particularly, happy in the circumstances, but they are at least making a more diluted sacrifice. And everything encompasses political, civilian, cultural life. You have to, of course, make a report between the two. This does not mean, again, that we are looking at a Ukrainian defeat, right? There is no hint to that in objective terms and general indicators. Again, politics can change everything in the world, internationally, however things align, what the West does, what Russia does. This is not a decided war, also because otherwise it would have already ended. And we have no signs, even that the end is close. So, again, that's how you know that things are not lost, in a sense. Not like, okay, the Ukrainians have suffered this terrible defeat, and now there hasn't been that kind even of climax yet, or anything that resembles approaching that or tilting sort of towards collapse on either side. What we have described, all the various adaptations to the situation increasingly favor remote warfare. The Russians have matched Ukraine's FPV edge in sheer volume while adding strategic strikes capabilities. The Russians have matched Ukraine's first-person view edge in sheer volume while adding strategic strike capabilities. Ukrainians produce millions of tactical drones but lag in long-range variants, as seen in recent refinery hits, including one that accounted for 1/4 of Ural oil refining capacity, by the way. No chemical weapons beyond low-level irritants or smoke have been observed. At this point in the last times, attrition remains unsustainable for both sides. Most importantly, attrition remains unsustainable for both sides. I mean, if you really look at the losses, they're disproportionate. They can't be sustained for an indefinite amount for both sides. Again, we already discussed why it's not like Russia is bigger. It's just twice bigger than Ukraine, maybe 1/4 because of the Russian-held parts and people who fled. But in general, right, the Russians are motivated as Ukrainians. And in general, this, as we've seen, the staggering level of casualties also from the Russian sides, higher than the Ukrainian ones, are much sort of questionable sort of evidence for the general. It doesn't matter how broken the sense of Russian civic sort of education or political involvement, really public life, public opinion really is. This is something that is also impacting Russian society, two levels that we understand naturally being sustainable in absolute terms, but in relative terms to what, right? To which end game, to which kind of sustainability. For Ukrainians, it's easy. Either you fight or you die as a country, as a nation. So it's obvious. And we realize how, let's say, battered a country in this situation could be, not because Ukrainians do not have a relentless spirit and a great will to really slaughter Russians in great amounts. It's that, as we've seen, losses are losses. Where you can't ignore, right? When, I don't know, your brother, your son, your father died, it's something that really, affects you at an incredibly deep level. It's sort of so beautiful. It's so darkly romantic, right? It's something from the external. It inspires. It makes you say, "Oh my God!" It's even something motivating in and of itself, right? For all the sacrifice already made. This is absolutely true. That's actually a real dynamic, but it's also extremely hard. It's paid at a very heavy price. The Ukrainians hold a technological edge, but Russians dominate through scaled production. sometimes in ridiculous ways, hastened, literally handcrafted, and they have enormous delays. Again, never made a video about Russian production, whatever. Things have remained, however, more or less in the same scale, right? So we're not looking at a war that is being significantly altered in dynamics. There are some aspects that are shifting, but within the realm of the secondary. What lays ahead? Well, there is an anticipated Russian winter campaign that could involve, if we take into account the sort of the figures of the recent employments, 800, 1,000 drones per attack, escalating from 100 to 100, paired with 100 to 100 missiles versus recent 45, 47, or prior 10, 13. The last peak was 180. So remember, the Russians stocked them and send them at waves in broader strategical sense, because they pile up. Otherwise, it's not because they're readily available. And again, they happen every once in a while, as we've seen also with intensification from this year. It was staggering, and really shows how, in that sense, the Russians have upgraded. It's not like they can arrive to an infinite, but this hits are very, very tough. And of course, we've seen also with a dreadful amount of civilian losses on the Ukrainian side. As far as the Ukrainian refinery rates that have become also a new normal in a sense, they may scale themselves from 80 to 180, 120 to 200, 300 by summer 2026. This is very interesting because that really erodes Russian logistics and fuel supplies amid reported shortages that are already in state. So Russians blend tactical and strategic strikes against depots, runways, energy infrastructure, and production side. I mean, that's what they target in Ukraine. The war's outcome, some say, will hinge on drone mass production, logistical resilience, the preservation of infantry for decisive breakthroughs. Largely, yes. They are, however, blended into some major strategic effort that these elements are just sort of normally serving. We're not looking at the fundamental alteration of the art of war. We're looking in any case at something extraordinary in the sense that two armies that have been fighting for so long with such great scale are basically the most experienced armies in the world right now. And that does matter. It's not everything, but it's definitely, especially in relation with one another, this particular type of context, also a marvel, so to say, to see, given the, let's say, the fact that they are compacting along that pattern, right? So it's not like things have necessarily to escalate further. If anything, the two contenders, as we have understood, are ever wearier. They can't rely on this more technical means, but you must also understand that regardless of the staggering losses that we have outlined, there is, so that reveals that the system does, of course, kill and does work, is a blood-oiled, say, well-blooded machine in that sense, in a dramatic way. But it's still something that you can't account clausewilitzingly in pure military terms. There are political guidances, directives, and that's why we do not know. We haven't the palest idea of how this is going to end. I mean, there are scenarios, of course, spectrums, ranges, possibilities, whatever. However, we're far from any kind of solution, unfortunately enough, also because this means that other hundreds of thousands, not millions, are going to die. Again, and this is terrifying at the only thought, but unfortunately, destruction is not going to stop. Unfortunately, this is not, unless it's, for some reason, this ends with some greater pressure, we have no idea. But again, we've seen how the talks of peace have basically shipwrecked. Never was, especially from Russia, of course, any kind of interest for any end of the war. For the Ukrainians, it would be enough to end the war and end of the problem. It's the Russians who are attacking. It's the Russians that are continuing. They don't care, right? They are they're bogged down. They have lots of reasons while they are in the game. In a sense, you even understand the logic behind that. The rationale is a bit more difficult to understand, but also at this point, what the hell do you even do, right? You freeze the lines, you do, but it's what have you obtained? What are you going to tell to the people? Equally, Ukrainians, of course, have legitimately no intention whatsoever to stop. They don't have any choice. They're tired, but they are still functional. There's no crack inside. They're just operating more or less along the patterns we've always seen. The Russians are catching up in different ways, and they have the upper hand. But as we've seen from the scales of losses and for a ridiculous amount of territory compared to the shocking magnitude of Ukrainian territorial extension, like there is here no actual end in sight. We're, in a sense, always saying the same thing. We can say it in different ways, but this is it. It would be sort of beautiful to some extent to have an answer, because this is what we've been seeking. That's why also we care about this war in particular. We care about warfare, why we care about military history, why we care about politics, why we care about our countries, other countries. This is the world we live in. It's a pretty dramatic situation. I think it's a much more dangerous situation than it seems, not because of the escalation that people are, again, seeing everywhere happening at every corner, but because, at least in the moment, it's the end game, right? What is the end game? What is the actual solution to this, right? How does it drag on, right? If not through a massive bloodbath, a massive slaughter. This is actually the problem. Also, what good can ever emerge from that, right? The best way for this to end is to put an increasing pressure on Russia. And I think here, of course, we have to look at the American administration, in part to Europe, and the situation, however, is still to be resolved on the battlefield, and so that means what we very well know. I will not digress further. I must say that I would like the series to last the shortest time possible, but it's not possible, and so at least as you've seen, and the only sort of consolation, the only solace from this is that at least we can sort of argument on the complexity of it, the seriousness of it, the scale of it, and if anything, build a common narrative that can help providing with the right political framework and unity to settle the matter, because it's all about political unity, as always. This thing is, I think, obvious, and the war in and of itself is dreadfully telling us that, as I just discussed it, either you're, motivated, you are politically cohesive, or it's not. In the West, it seems as always the West is declining or whatever. The West has huge issues, but it's not like the others are in better condition. They aren't at all. It's an illusion. It's always been, and a war like the Russian invasion of Ukraine is actually one of the greatest proofs of this. Without mentioning that, aside from the miscalculation of not just the strategy in the war and what this would turn into, probably the fact that Russians do not understand the West. They haven't the palest idea of what it is or how it works, and that's the greatest advantage that we actually have. we are much stronger than anyone probably realizes, at least in the conventional sort of average flattened version that we're looking at today. So it's obviously a matter of realizing this and understanding that the system is holding. That if the protests, I don't know, for Gaza that are just, again, communistic extremism without any other construct whatsoever are the ways we're seeing now, so basically null, and that there is actually a great deal of national conservatism, of, sense that indiscriminate immigration has to end and so on. I see actually the forces are coming back. There is an absolute backbone for reinforcing the West, for remilitarizing to a degree, for helping Ukrainians achieving their objectives, and fundamentally holding. Right, it doesn't have to happen into a dramatic showdown. It has to be how it's going to be anyway, but it has to basically at some point fade away. It has to stop. It has to stop in a consequential fashion, right? Because at some point it stops, right? That's as much as we know and understand, we can appreciate. In any case, again, I ramble a bit too much, but again, for this video, it's important to talk. For today, I, however, stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.